Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. So what we're doing today, we are going through and recommending a couple entry-level books. I think there's plenty of people out there that actually have videos recommending ways to expand your taste in particular genres, but there's oftentimes a lot of people that just skip over some of the more easily accessible and generally popular books. Now, not everything I'm going to mention today is the most well-known books, so I will sort of skew off into a few sort of side paths. But just to be blunt, for example, the two people that I'm going to spend probably the most time talking about are Stephen King and Clive Barker. So instead, what I'm going to try to do is just go through by author, mention which books of theirs that I actually think are worthwhile to pick up, and why. Also, another thing, what I mean by accessibility is that generally they use relatively simple language. It's not the most complex examples within that particular genre, and for the most part should be accessible on Kindle if you want to actually buy that book on Kindle. The reason why I'm coming up with this list, the holiday season's popping up. This video should post for Thanksgiving, so it may not be super helpful for Thanksgiving itself, but I know a lot of people do a lot of traveling, go to places where they may not have access to do as much as they may like, so bringing a book along may be a good way to pass the time. And if you're really just starting to dip your toe into reading, it helps to have some recommendations of things that you can read that are beginner friendly. Another thing that was sort of an inspiration for this is fantasy is one of my favorite genres. Problem is 99% of the time when you ask someone for a fantasy recommendation, it's part one of a 72-part series that you have to dedicate a solid chunk of your life to reading. It's like every fantasy author is trying to replicate One Piece in terms of how long their series are. So first up tonight, probably the most prolific and popular author of my lifetime, and the only one that I know outright will be known way past his death. That would be Stephen King. So what book would I recommend starting with for Stephen King if you're curious about his works? One of two of them, and this will be a general thing that I would say as well. If you're interested in an author, but you're not really sure what book to start with and they actually have more than one, if they have an anthology series, start with those anthologies. So in the case of Stephen King, Nightmares and Dreamscapes is an excellent book to pick up to read some of his short stories. There's a wide variety of his stories in Nightmares and Dreamscapes. They're all pretty good. This is more on his fiction side. If you notice, most of the books that I'll actually show when I have a physical copy, they're worn out. They're from my old style collection. For the last several years, I've primarily bought books on Kindle. So this little thing right here has about 400 books on it. And most of these are books that are from my childhood or recent acquisitions where I'm actually trying to get a more polished book collection. But anyway, Nightmares and Dreamscapes, a very good anthology series. If you're more interested in going with Stephen King stuff that is less horror and more fiction stories, so along the lines of Green Mile, then Different Seasons would be the book to pick up. This actually has the story that was turned into Shawshank Redemption in it. And you can notice where a rat at some point has gotten a hold of this one and chewed off the corner. But either Nightmares and Dreamscapes or Different Seasons is a good place to start with Stephen King. For Stephen King's realistic works, I would actually recommend The Green Mile. This looks like it's a relatively large book because of the fact that I bought it back when it was being released as individual little novellas. But it's not really that big of a book altogether, and it's a pretty good, straightforward story as far as Stephen King's works go. There's a reason why when they converted it into a movie, the movie ended up being relatively award-winning. And what you'll see with Stephen King is while the endings and whatnot for his horror stories tend to be more in the hit-or-miss category, his stories that are grounded a little bit more in realism actually tend to have a much more solid finish to them. And The Green Mile is an example of one of those. Now, if you do want to read something more in line with his horror novels, you want to actually read something that's got a little bit more of a scary bent to it, personally I would recommend Salem's Lot. I don't have a physical copy of it. The last time I read it was on Kindle. It is an excellent vampire story that actually sticks to vampires in the way that they were originally delivered, where they're very scary and they're meant to be scary entities. So Salem's Lot, excellent vampire story, and you'll also notice my recommendations for him were pretty early on in his career. One thing I've found to be true with authors is if you're actually interested in their works, start with their earlier works, simply because usually they actually refine their writing style as they go. They get better what you would expect because they're basically getting practice in. The earlier books, while they're not as polished, they also do tend to be a little bit more accessible. So most of my recommendations for him come from his earlier works, and due to that accessibility. I think King's earlier works actually tend to be more consistently good. He doesn't really have anything that I would consider a flop, but the longer he's been writing, he's written over 60 books at this point. Some of his later stuff's not necessarily as good as the older. He still has things where he hits it out of the park, like his book about the JFK assassination is apparently excellent, and that's a relatively recently published book, but I do find he was very consistent early on, and so his earlier books are not just easy to read, but they're good to read. Now, if you are interested in probably his most popular series and the thing that he considers his magnum opus, the Dark Tower series, the book you'll be looking for to start with is The Gunslinger. If you're interested in westerns, this would be a good book to start with. It is a fantasy series in the long run, but this first book reads much more like a post-apocalyptic western than it does strictly a fantasy series. I don't tend to recommend people start with The Dark Tower because this series actually connects everything else he has going. You're going to be a lot better off reading some of his earlier books when I'm not 100% convinced that he was planning on actually making them all into one super connected universe. I think early on he was just putting Easter eggs in, and then as he started getting into the Dark Tower, he realized he could link everything together, and then from that point it started becoming much more deliberate. But I do think reading some of his other works first before investing in the Dark Tower would be a good idea. And even if you're interested in trying to get into fantasy series, I don't know that I would recommend the Dark Tower as a starting fantasy series because it's relatively complex as far as fantasy series go. The first book, not as much as later ones, but the complexity in the Dark Tower actually kind of exponentially increases from book to book. All right, so that's all my recommendations for Stephen King. Second author that I would recommend for sort of fledgling readers that are really trying to get into works, and yet again a primarily horror author, I would recommend Clive Barker. Now, just like Stephen King, he actually has a series of anthology books that you could pick up, and you can either pick them up as compendiums or you can actually pick up the individual volumes. Those are the Books of Blood. This is a compendium for books 1 through 3. This is actually book 2 by itself, but either way, these are excellent sort of introductions into Clive Barker. And the reality is, for the vast majority of his books, you need to be somewhat familiar with his horror styles because they spill over into his other works. He is well known for being the person that created the Hellraiser series, and that is actually one of the books I would recommend, which is The Hellbound Heart. This little tiny novella spawned probably one of the most infamous horror movie series of all time. And it's also one of the big inspirations for what is referred to as body horror. And there's a good reason for that. Barker is very good at coming up with ways of twisting flesh or twisting the appearance of a creature or a person in a way that would be shockingly painful, but turns it into a really monstrous, just shocking visage. So body horror was his key early on in his career. And it's even present in some of his more toned down series. But his horror books, I would recommend starting with. You could start with these anthologies. Realistically, The Hellbound Heart is so small that if you wanted to, you could actually start with this. It's not so big as to be prohibitive in terms of just really getting into a new series. And it's also relatively easy to read. Not terribly different from the actual movie Hellraiser. If you've seen Hellraiser, there are some differences, but it's not so different that it's going to feel unfamiliar with you. So if you're wanting to sort of slip into horror, Clive Barker is a good alternative to Stephen King if you want something just a little bit less mainstream. But aside from his horror stories, Barker is actually my favorite fantasy author. And he's not as well known for fantasy, but this is my favorite fantasy book of all time, and that is Magica. And this was originally split up into 2 books, so you could actually get either the single volume or get the 2 books separate. Now, I don't know that it's a great beginner's fantasy book, but this particular one actually includes an appendices in the back. It has a bunch of made-up terminology and things that go along with it, which is pretty staple for fantasy, but it gets dropped in slowly enough that it's actually pretty easy to pick up. So he's very good at doing the world building in it, and I would recommend it at some point, but probably not as your starter fantasy book. And if you want something fantasy, but this is probably the only book series that I can think of that does this, and this one's wore out. My copies have destroyed it over the years. But if you want a fantasy book that leans more on the side of horror than just traditional fantasy, The Great and Secret Show by Clive Barker, which does have 1 sequel. It's supposed to have more than 1, but each of these books can actually be read independently. So even though it was actually, like, at the bottom of it, you'll see it referred to as the first book of the art. I believe it was supposed to be a quartet, but I could be mistaken in that. He hasn't had any word about the other sequels to those in a while, so I'm not sure that they will actually come out, but neither one of them really leaves you off on such a cliffhanger that reading them would feel like potentially a lot of people are going to eventually feel about the Game of Thrones series. Now, again, I would probably recommend for a beginner reader sticking to Barker's horror stories, because his fantasies are relatively complicated, so they may not be the most beginner friendly, but if you're trying to dip your toe into fantasy, there's not a lot of choices that you have for simplicity. But either way, Barker's works are fantastic, have had a massive influence on me, and they're some of the works that I enjoy the most. And this is actually my 3rd copy of Magica. I've got another of this exact same version sitting over there with the cover off, and originally I owned the split up versions of it. Clive Barker, give him a try if you're just starting out for horror. Alright, so since we've talked a little bit about fantasy, I feel like I need to recommend some fantasy books at this point, just to go ahead and say what would be good ways to dip your toes into that. So the first person that I would actually recommend for beginning fantasy fans, or people that are interested in getting into fantasy as a genre, would be Wight. I have a whole video going over his entire publication history and discussing what I think about each series that he has and giving a little bit about them if you're interested in that. I'll try to remember and link it down in the description, but he is excellent at writing very accessible, very digestible fantasy series. And I feel like the Traveler's Gate series, which was one of his first series, is actually one of the most accessible, more beginner-friendly fantasy books that doesn't have a whole boatload of sequels. He has a series now that is a little bit more popular than that, that's called Cradle, but Cradle has a ton of books to it. Now, granted, Cradle reads incredibly quickly, so you don't really feel like you've read your way through that, like a dozen or so books, but the Traveler's Gate series, you can get the whole collection relatively cheap and actually dig your way through them pretty fast. And I feel like they're pretty well-constructed stories. They give you a good idea where he's going. And if you're going to read them, you might as well read them to start with, because those were also his first published books. So his quality of writing has only went up from there. His quality of world building has only went up. So, Wight. Now, if you want a more classical fantasy series, one that appeals to what you call high fantasy, no one for high fantasy can be recommended other than JRR Tolkien as your beginner. Now, specifically, The Hobbit. I do not recommend starting with Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is a very dense tome of a book, and there's something that happened between The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings where his general storytelling style changed pretty significantly. The Hobbit reads almost like you're sitting around a campfire with just your super friendly uncle, and he's sitting and telling you a story. So it reads like a campfire tale being told, which makes it an incredibly easy read, and it's nowhere near as long as Lord of the Rings. And it's also not 100% necessary that you go on and read Lord of the Rings afterwards. So while it is part of a greater series, it is a standalone enough novel that you could read it on its own and be fine. Peter Jackson, yes, turned it into a movie series that's every bit as long as Lord of the Rings. I'm still not 100% certain how he managed to do that, because the book is significantly smaller than Lord of the Rings and is significantly more approachable. So, highly recommended if you want more classical fantasy, so elves, orcs, that type of stuff. Will Wight, good for modern fantasy, where it's more about completely imagined worlds, magic systems, that type of stuff. Tolkien, more traditional high fantasy, so elves, orcs, dwarves, and the traditional sort of D&D style settings. There is one more fantasy author that I would recommend, and I have his book around here somewhere, but I am not 100% certain where it's at. And that would be Terry Pratchett. Now, there is one really massive issue when it comes to reading Terry Pratchett, and I'll try to remember to put something up on the screen now about this. The chronology of his books is complicated. He has multiple series that all take place in the same world, and they overlap. You don't need to really be familiar with them to enjoy the other ones, but they all follow different aspects of things going on in the Discworld. Now, there's one strike against this being a beginner series, and it's not the language, because it's actually very accessible linguistically. It is at least somewhat of a parody series. And the issue is you have to be a decently well-versed reader to be aware of some of the things that he's making fun of or making references to. So as a beginner reader, his series may not be the absolute best for you. However, if you're familiar with the stuff that you had to read in high school, or you're still in high school and reading some of these classic books and stuff right now, it may work. Personally, I would recommend just reading his books in publication order. His writing style really refines over time, and he gets significantly better by the end than he was at the beginning, to the point where, looking back on it, once I got to his last couple books that he wrote before dementia set in fully and he just stopped being able to write, I don't know that I could have went back and enjoyed them as much as I did if I didn't read them in the order that he released them. Because you can see marked improvement from The Color of Magic, which was his first one, up to things like Clax, which came way later down the line. They're all good books. This is, yet again, I kind of hesitate to recommend them because there's a massive amount of them, and I mentioned earlier that can be sort of a daunting factor when it comes to doing fantasy series, but in a lot of modern fantasy lists, he seems to be just kind of left off. I feel like Terry Pratchett is on par with Stephen King, but doesn't get the recognition that he should. He did at one point in time, but since he's not been around for a while now, it seems like his name's sort of fading off faster than I would have expected. But anyway, people like me will help keep him around. So let's dip into things that are a little bit further outside of my wheelhouse now. Horror and fantasy are things that I'm very much more familiar with than anything outside those genres. So let's start with another book that I have covered on the channel. Quan Millz, This Hoe Got Roaches in Her Crib. Don't be fooled by the title. It's an excellent book. I'm not going to expand on it a whole lot because I've went over it in detail in my own review, and my wife and I are working on a podcast where we're going to talk about it a little bit. It is an excellent book. His titles are sort of the literary equivalent of clickbait. They are relevant to the story, but they're not the entire story. If you want something out of what would be considered urban fiction, this would be the author to check out. He is excellent. Love his stuff, and he's actually kind of funny on TikTok as well. If you want a book that falls into the genre of historic fiction, Louis L'Amour's The Walking Drum. This book was actually one of the few books that my father recommended I read. He enjoyed Lewis L'Amour as a young man because most of L'Amour's books are westerns. This is the only one that he wrote in this series. This book takes place in 12th century Europe. It's interesting. It's genuinely interesting. It's not fantasy. This is actually truly historical fiction. However, if you threw elves and whatnot in, it would be a similar idea to a more high fantasy setting, just minus the magic and actually based in the real world. But it's written really well. And the one thing my father warned me about with this going into it that I understood by the end of it, and I'll warn you about it as well, it ends on a cliffhanger, and L'Amour never went back to this series. No idea why. He just never approached it again. So it's worth reading if you like history and you also want to get into reading. The Walking Drum is a very accessible book. L'Amour is a good accessible author. If you would rather have a history book that's more in a Western setting, he has a bunch of historical fiction that's set in the West. So you could check those out. They would work as well. But be aware of what you're walking into and know that if you're reading this one, you're choosing to read something that's going to end on a cliffhanger, but you'll enjoy the ride. Now, if your interest is more in line with things like mysteries, then a book that I haven't reviewed on the channel, but I was planning on making an individual video for, is Strange Houses by Uketsu. Now, the type of person that likes to read or wants to get into reading that I would say recommending this book to would be someone that prefers non-traditional literature. Like there's a lot of diagrams, say, well, just like the cover, whereas flooring diagrams for houses. Now, granted, this has the Japanese text on it. The book on the inside is actually translated fully to English. Another type of person that this book may appeal to is someone that's actually somewhat used to reading plays or scripts, because a solid chunk of this book is actually written as like a dialogue format where you have multiple people talking to each other and the blocks of text are done that way. So it's almost like a play format with some literary sections in between that are just descriptions of events that connect the various scenes of discussion. So if you enjoy theater, or you have actually had some experience reading plays or those sorts of things, it may be a good novel to sort of act as a stepping stone from plays to just novels. But it is an enjoyable book. It's chilling Japanese mystery. It's a good mystery. It's interesting seeing how things are built up, but I didn't really think it was that chilling. Still good book though, and really straightforward, done in very simple English. Now, I think that is partly because it was originally written in Japanese and it translated to English, and so the person that did the translations had to kind of be careful to make sure to maintain meaning, and you can't get a whole lot of rosy, flowery language when you're doing that type of work. So it stays within a very graspable vocabulary, and it's a very easily approachable book. It's not super long, but it's good. It's a good stepping stone into mysteries. If you really dive into mysteries and you want something a little bit more complicated, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo is top tier, but not necessarily beginner book. It's long, it's dense. I would start with something just a bit simpler. So, Strange Houses. By the way, buy my book. No, just kidding. Yeah, but you can if you want to, but that's not one that I'm going to